You know the picture of Dorian Gray is about more than just looking hot forever, right? I feel like everybody knows this if they took it in high school, but it is now very important to me that everybody knows this. We're gonna double check. Because I just read this Deadline article and my brain just exploded a little bit. See, according to these people, Netflix has just greenlit a new Dorian Gray adaptation that will take place in the modern times. I'm cool with that, that's great. I'm all for modern adaptations of classic works and taking them into a new cultural context. I think that's one of the best ways to prove that your story is still relevant today. I'm here for a remix of Dorian Gray, though my favorite will forever be Aaron Trevitt playing him in Penny Dreadful, where he's just miserable half the time because he took up residence with the Bride of Frankenstein and immediately regretted his choices. Anyway, my point is that I think The Picture of Dorian Gray is a really good gothic horror novel, and it would be excellent translated into the modern day. But then I read this paragraph on the Deadline article, and this paragraph is haunting me. If this paragraph didn't exist, I would not have written 12 pages. Written by Katie Rose Rogers, The Greys is the contemporary take on Oscar Wilde's classic about our fascination with eternal youth set against the backdrop of the modern beauty industry. In a twist on the gothic novel, the series revolves around siblings Basil and Dorian Gray. I have notes. I could say I don't really know where to start, but I just told you I wrote 12 pages on this, so I do know where to start. But I would first like to explain to you that the conceit of this entire video is dumb. We are literally going off of 2 sentences and absolutely none of the execution and none of the promise that the series has to bring itself into a modern context. There is no product yet. This is yelling at the sun for rising. It is way too early to begin to remotely judge whether or not it's going to be a loyal or good adaptation of The Picture of Dorian Gray with modern updates. But if you're going to modernize Dorian Gray, why did you pick the beauty industry? Like, I get it, but it's one of the most obvious choices and not really what the book's about. I get that the TV writers have to have a catchy pitch when they're explaining this, and this is probably just their elevator tagline, and it's going to maybe be about more than this. But there's a very obvious modern day thing that's going on with us right now that applies beautifully to Dorian Gray that I feel like they could have just said instead of the beauty industry. I'll get there, put a pin in that. Also, the siblings thing is a little weird. I can maybe see where they might be going with the siblings angle, you know, if you just forget what subtext is. Dorian is probably going to be a woman in this version, judging by the misspelling of the name and or whoever does the editing in these articles did not do their job. One of these 2 things is true. Conceptually, the character of Dorian as a woman, I feel like would have something to say when you're doing something that has the themes of this book. That's the kind of change that is intriguing to me instead of an immediate facepalm. The siblings one confuses me. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, and in the 10th grade, Mrs. Ryle said that if I wanted to write an essay, I had to lay some groundwork first. So in this video, we're going to do a crash course on The Picture of Dorian Gray, summarizing the novel, talking about a couple of prominent themes, and then we're going to talk about how those can apply beautifully to a modern context, and how focusing on Dorian Gray's eternal youth against today's beauty industry is the most milquetoast jumping off point I can possibly think of for this story. Hi, by the way, my handle's name is Crow, and welcome to the channel where I talk about whatever I want, usually books and video games. If you like what I do here, you can hit one of the buttons to make sure you stick around for more. And you can also find me on Patreon, where I do one exclusive video a month. Last month was Brandon Sanderson. This month's poll just wrapped up, so now I have choices. Let's get into it. So Dorian Gray is actually one of those books that I find to be incredibly entertaining without any caveats. Just like if you read it in a modern day context, you've met people who are characters in this book, and it's just so incredibly relatable in a very specific way that I really don't think ages. Like, as a 20-something who's able to spend money and have friend groups in a metropolitan area, this is incredibly the vibe. Of course, we're not talking about the working class, that's lowbrow fiction. We're talking about the social dynamics of the elite. However, the human quality of different relationships in your life shaping you in different ways and how you are perceived can be contrary to your actual character, how you maybe deal with bad situations by avoiding them rather than confronting them, and the pressure to take advantage of your youth and embrace every possible facet of life before you expire is, you know, pretty relevant. Now here's the larger plot. We open on my favorite chaotic chaos character, Henry Woodson, visiting his friend Basil. Basil's an artist who's finishing off a portrait of one of his new friends, Dorian Gray. And Basil's really embarrassed about the painting. It's his greatest work yet, and he captures Dorian Gray in such a beautiful light where he has all of his possible best qualities highlighted, and he is basically a perfect representation of the promise of youth and goodness and purity. But the problem is that this portrait is reflecting too much of Basil's soul and his opinion on Dorian Gray to an embarrassing degree. As an artist, when Basil makes art, he is putting himself on the canvas, and it's really the exposure of himself whenever he makes anything. Thus, he feels like this portrait basically rats out his raging man crush on Dorian. Henry, who is a married man who subtly hates his life, and I adore him, does not make art. He usually spends his time criticizing others in order to cope. And he gets really interested in Dorian because Basil covets him so much, so he kind of sees like the opportunity for a mess and slides on in there. So when Dorian comes to sit for the final touches of the painting, Basil tries to very subtly like boot out Henry, and Henry just sees the opportunity and just like wedges his way in there. And he strikes up a conversation with Dorian, praising his youth and the opportunities that he has at this point in his life, and how if he squanders them in this narrow period of time, he's basically wasting his life. Henry is a man who lives in regret, who did everything he was supposed to and now is seeking out more hedonistic things. He's married, but he avoids his wife at all costs, and it's implied that he hasn't really lived the life that he wanted. So when he sees that Dorian is this hot young 20-something who has all this potential in front of him, he's basically screaming at Dorian not to be like him and to embrace every possible facet of what life will offer him in his youth. Fear the Reaper that is 30. Basically, if you've ever had an older aunt or uncle who corners you with a drink at a family party and decides to just dump all of the things they wish they did instead of getting married at 22. So when the painting session's over and Dorian gets to see the finished work, he's envious of the painting that Basil has made of himself. And Dorian impulsively wishes that this portrait would age instead of him. That'll get important later, obviously, but for now we're here for the catty Victorian men's relationship. Henry tries to get Basil to go out to the club with him. Basil tries to keep Dorian there by saying that he doesn't want to go anywhere. And Henry goes, sick, cool, have fun with your paintings, I'll just go take him out. I think it's against the bro code to steal your friend's crush, but Henry doesn't care. They start hanging out together, going to clubs. Henry's basically giving Dorian access to a lot more hedonistic avenues of living with his friends. But Dorian's still a good boy, and after a couple of weeks, Dorian comes by and declares that he's in love with an actress from a poor side of town. Her name is Sybil, and she's a Shakespearean player, and she's an actress who's just so good and commands the stage. And Dorian is head over heels. He doesn't care that she's a poor. He intends to propose to her right there the next time he sees her. But first, he wants to show her off to his friends. However, the day he chooses to take them, she puts on an intentionally terrible performance because with him, she has experienced perfect love and now doesn't really see the point in acting. And there's this part that no one ever mentions in the summaries, but while she's putting on this absolutely terrible performance, Henry is the guy who is the first one to dismiss everything. Dorian is willing to stay and watch her all the way through, but Henry is the one that criticizes her and calls the entire thing bad art and embarrassing and urges them to leave. And I feel that secondhand embarrassment. I feel like that's a great detail. You know, you're excited for something, it's one of those things that's just like totally you and works with you, and then you take friends and you realize that it's embarrassing because they're not that into it. You know, in this case, like it was bad. It was a bad performance. And it's like, that sucks. That sucks that you like showed this part of yourself that you were so excited for. And then it turns out to be something that can be mocked. Like, poor Dorian. Anyway, Dorian breaks up with Sybil right there because he's so embarrassed and she's a bad actress now and he just doesn't know how to cope. And when he goes home, this is the first time he notices that his portrait looks different. And it's not uglier, it's just that the expression is meaner. It looks like it has a sneer to it. But this is enough for Dorian to realize that this portrait is actually taking on his moral issues. And he goes, wait, this is bad. I should correct my behavior immediately. And so he writes a letter to send to Sybil to basically apologize and do the right thing and elope with her. It's not the answer, buddy. That's the worst plan I ever heard, but I love it. Only the next morning, before he has a chance to do anything, Henry arrives with the news that Sybil has passed away. Shortly after he left, she went up to her dressing room and ingested something and was found on the floor dead. This was always a bit of a heavy reaction to me, but I get why it's here. I just kind of wish that it was something worse than what Dorian did, but like, whatever, fine. Essentially, what was a dalliance for Dorian was a monumental crashing of Sybil's world, so yeah, okay, cool. But after hearing the news of Sybil's passing, Dorian doesn't really know how to feel. He feels like he should be heartbroken and destroyed. The love of his life is gone now, after like one tragic event, but he just like can't really feel grief or mourning. I would argue that shock could probably be an emotion if he actually felt something for her, but I actually like Henry's theory. Henry basically says that her passing was too beautiful to truly mourn. It's actually really artistic, you know? Great tragedies never happen to men like this, and you should be considering yourself lucky. He also floats the idea that Dorian probably wasn't in love with Sybil, but instead in the way that she could play other characters. Dorian never loved the actual Sybil, just the idea of her, the one that she put on the stage, so when Sybil passes away, the Sybil of Dorian's mind still exists. I think Henry's very astute, he's just being a dick about it. But also I love Henry's subtle characterization here, because the first thing that he does is that he sends the newspaper article to Dorian and tells him not to talk to anyone until he gets there. The minute he gets there, he's frantically asking Dorian about if anyone can identify him, or if anyone knows his name, or if he can be linked to her passing in any way whatsoever. Once he is sure that there is no way that Dorian can get in any amount of trouble for this, he finally calms down and starts talking about Dorian's emotions. I think this is again a great emphasis of Henry's character, where he's a guy who talks the talk about acting hedonistically and embracing life, but ultimately he's incredibly concerned with reputation. The good news is that Dorian never gave Sybil his full name and instead just had her call him Prince Charming, and no one else ever met him, so there's no possible consequences to his situation. Anyway, Dorian thinks more about the portrait and is kind of freaking out about the fact that his soul might be corrupted forever and he wasn't able to make amends. So he decides to stash the portrait away in his childhood bedroom. It's really ironic that it's up there now that it will hold his greatest corruption after he's been such an innocent. It's implied that Dorian grew up wealthy, but perhaps not in the best family home. He recounts being lonely and perhaps didn't have a lot of life experience, and Dorian's implied lack of experience in early life I think is a good detail for when we're talking about a youth, fresh-faced person who is the ideal of purity and innocence. Like, if you're innocent just because you haven't experienced life, does that inherently make you good? I think it just makes you naive and open to a lot of influence. In reaction to Dorian's tragedy, Henry decides to give Dorian the copy of a yellow book manifesto that he has on heathenism, which is also French. We all know those people can't be trusted. And this kicks off Dorian's 5-year spree of doing whatever he wants and taking up any hedonistic indulgence that he wants, such as considering taking up Catholicism, reading about Darwinism, hosting parties. Point is, our man is living it up, and if you've read an edition of this book after 2011, you even get this mild hint that he may have been engaging in premaritals with men. That took until 2011, guys. Real racy stuff, you know, be scandalized. There's like other vague examples of him getting into fights and hanging out with the wrong crowd, you know, like basic stuff. Our man is not out here kicking cats or anything. Like those wicked evil deeds described in Victorian times is essentially what a third grader's idea of cursing is. Anyway, with each passing year and misdeed, Dorian's portrait gets uglier and uglier, and soon, at the age of 25, it is absolutely wretched. But while Dorian's face is intact, his reputation is still suffering, and he's starting to feel the consequences of that with some people in his social circle, where he's suddenly not really invited to the same parties, some people refuse to associate with him, and every now and then there's just this like quiet remark, but it's never anything that's too out in the open, always just a, you know, slight underhand criticism. No one ever directly confronts Dorian for his bad behavior until Basil, a close friend, actually decides to, you know, talk to him about it. Before Basil's about to leave for Paris, he basically goes to Dorian and pleads with him to act better and do better in life because everybody's talking about all these heathenistic things he's doing, and Basil's worried for him and his reputation, and for the quality of his own soul. Somewhere in this conversation, they get to talking about the portrait, and when Basil asks to see it, Dorian refuses. And Basil thinks that it's because Dorian has realized that all of his love and adoration for Dorian was on that canvas, and he realized, and it was so obvious that it embarrassed Dorian, so he hid it away. Dorian's pretty psyched because he thinks this is an opportunity to duck the fact that he's been using the portrait as like a moral compass to absorb all of his evil hedonistic deeds, but he eventually comes clean and shows Basil. But now the man in the portrait is a hideous aged gremlin that looks nothing like Dorian. Basil insists that it can't possibly be his work. It has to be something completely different. It's a practical joke. There's something wrong with the paints, the fumes. This isn't his idealized version of Dorian. This is something else entirely. He's just horrified by the image of Dorian's true soul. And Dorian, seeing this, reacts badly. He basically takes a knife and impulsively stabs Basil. And this is the best part of the book, by the way, because the minute Dorian is done, he sees Basil's body like collapsed on the table where he just did that to him, and he refuses to acknowledge that it's Basil anymore. He doesn't recognize it as a person or a body. He doesn't refer to it as anything other than the thing. And he just like walks away and tries to forget that it happened. He won't go near it, he won't touch it, he won't acknowledge it, he won't speak on it, which is a similar reaction to what he did after he figured out that Sybil had passed away and that he didn't really feel much on it. Dorian doesn't even clean up the crime scene himself, he blackmails an acquaintance to do it. Then he goes to an opium den, runs into Sybil's brother, who confronts him because he's been called Prince Charming around the area. But when Dorian shows Sybil's brother his face, he goes, "Dude, I'm too young to have been the guy who dated your sister like 10 years ago." Next is my other favorite scene, where Dorian is at a dinner party where he realizes that he's just moved Basil's body, hidden it away, and gotten away with the crime, and now has to keep it together in front of company. And he's just like sitting there listening to a bunch of people talk about their days and like petty concerns and arguments, and just like trying to appear as like unaffected as possible. And it's an excellent scene. There has been a body in his house for 3 days, and all he's doing here is debating about whether or not somebody should get married and who hosts the best party. I love it, it's great. I feel like Oscar Wilde had a couple of friends he had a bone to pick with. Anyway, shortly after that, there's a hunting party where they go to look for rabbits, and it happens to be that Sybil's brother is hiding in a bush and somebody accidentally shoots him. It's as ludicrous as the other deaths, whatever. Point is that Sybil's brother was the last remaining embodiment of possible consequences for Dorian, and now that he's gone, Dorian's technically free of all consequences for his bad actions. And Dorian can't take it. He goes to find Henry and desperately confesses what he did to Basil. But Henry doesn't believe him. It doesn't fit the character that he knows for Dorian. Henry looks Dorian up and down and goes, "You're not capable of that." And Dorian, who has been trying to be seen by Henry, cannot take it. I think it's like this denial of any possible evil deeds that Dorian has done that really tilts Dorian over the edge, because even though he's well acclaimed, he's not seen by anyone for who he is. I put my hair up because it was getting too fluffy. Let's keep going. Anyway, after this conversation, Dorian reflects on the fact that he's been a heathen all these years, and he like vows to be a better person. And I think the thing that really cuts at him is that Henry just looks at him and goes, "No, you won't. You're not going to be a better person because you're not capable of being a better person. You say you're going to change, but you're never going to change. You're always going to be trash." And it's so good, and it's so cutting and surprisingly astute of this man. I love Henry. He's the worst. Henry's denial of Dorian's possibility for change that really destroys him. And so Dorian finally takes a knife and tries to stab the painting. You cut away from Dorian's perspective at the end of the book, and a bunch of servants discover this old withered thing dead in front of a beautiful, pristine painting of a youthful Dorian Gray. End scene. So when we're thinking about the themes of Dorian Gray, his face card is a feature, but it's not the point of the novel. Like, it matters, but it matters in the way that life in general gives young white men a greater opportunity for success simply because they are more appealing to general society. The story of Dorian Gray isn't about gaining youth or beauty, it's about maintaining respectability. Being locked into a state where you are going to be able to embrace many opportunities offered to you. In a time of your life where you are, yes, the most physically appealing to everybody, but also in one where you recognizably do not have that much experience, and are thus considered less capable of misdeeds. Other characters don't strive to maintain their physical appearance, they strive to either indulge in opportunity or piously reserve themselves on a moral high ground. Dorian's eternal youth is more about preserving his innocence, about refusing to claim responsibility for his misdeeds in life. Him being frozen with the same face means that he cannot face the consequences for his misdeeds, nor can he be recognized for his internal changes. Youth and beauty is a side note that helps make this point, but it's not the full focus. It's very much like an American Psycho, where the punchline is that this man is able to get away with absolutely heinous deeds. It's partly about his looks, sure, but it's also his wealth, his status, and his ability to shirk consequence. Another theme is authenticity in art. If you haven't noticed, it's kind of important that Basil is a creator who does not have an objective opinion on Dorian Gray. Basil hasn't actually known Dorian for that long when we start the book. He's a new, interesting friend that Basil is idealizing. And the portrait of Dorian Gray is spelled out to you to not be an accurate representation of Dorian. It is instead Basil's raging man-crush manifesting, a unbridled documentation of his adoration for a man he hardly knows and his idealization of him. It's just like how Dorian fell in love with Sybil for her talent as an actress and not for her as a person. In contrast to this, Henry is a critic who never produces anything and shirks authenticity at every single point. And thus the medium of a painting and the creation of art in this book is direly important, because if you don't create, you don't show yourself and you don't expose yourself. As a subject of art, it's only other people laying their expectations upon you. As a critic of art, all you can do is tear down other people. There's also this general fear of authenticity and exposure in the book. There's this idea that once you know the real character of a person, they disappoint because their idealized version was the most interesting part of them. That's a part of Dorian's power. He's forever youthful, but he's also forever unknowable, and anything that anyone will ever think about him will simply be a projection. But once Basil gets to know Dorian's character, he's disappointed, and his illusion of this perfect man is shattered. In that same vein, Dorian learning that Sybil is a person is deeply unappealing to him. And again, Henry is a popular socialite, but not really someone with any true friends. Throughout the book, there's a prevalent setup that the tragedies of the poor are footnotes for the rich. Dorian's mother's backstory is that she eloped with a poor man, but then he passed on early, so then the mother went back to live with her father. So Dorian grew up rich, and the consequences of his father's early passing are negligible to the family because the mom could just retreat home to her safety net. Sybil's entire life is decimated when Dorian breaks off the engagement, and she was banking basically on that to be the next 40 years of her life. When Dorian wants to get rid of the body in his house, he blackmails a poorer acquaintance, and basically working-class hands clean up the crime scene for him. And in that same vein, he also hired a working-class group of people to move the portrait to his childhood bedroom. He never had to lift a finger for that. So there's this general idea that when Dorian is participating in things that are below his class, that it's an indulgence, a kind of fantasy vacation that he can come back from at any point because he still has his wealthy class and family to fall back on. And though the ramifications of his actions have serious consequences for the people living in it, for Dorian, a simple accident on a hunting trip where a man was hiding in the bush is, just like one of those days that can be moved on from quite splendidly. Dorian's status is untouchable. In addition, whenever something bad happens or there is something distasteful, there's a general reflection that society and people in this world will not acknowledge it. In fact, they will take great pains to lampshade it at all costs. The best example is Henry, who generally just refuses to speak on rumors or any kind of serious actions and crimes that he finds distasteful. And this manifests for Dorian because multiple times throughout the book he refuses to confront his sins by not speaking on them and denying they ever happened. With Sybil, he feels the emotional distance, and once he's decided that it's just a great tragedy, he doesn't want to speak on it again. Even though a lot of people know what Dorian is up to, nobody will directly talk to him about it. And Dorian's relationship with his own portrait is a literal representation of self-reflection. When he looks at it and doesn't like what he sees, he resolves to be a better person. But when he shuts it up in his childhood bedroom and refuses to look at it for long periods of time, it's literally him being unable or unwilling to face himself and the deeds that have gotten him to this point. This gets to be its most literal when Dorian literally denies who he is to escape consequences from Sybil's brother. Which leads to our climax, which is a lot like American Psycho, where Dorian has to admit his guilt to someone because he's gotten away with it. He has been able to live in denial for so long, but in denying his crimes, he's also denied himself and his own character. So the climax of Dorian stabbing the painting is him finally acknowledging himself and no longer living in denial of what he is. There's also reputation versus desire in this book. The implication in this book is that all things desirable are disreputable in Dorian Gray's world. In Victorian society, there is a certain set of expectations for how you will behave and what your life path will be, and when you do not conform to these, you are considered somebody who will be scorned and not completely trusted. The freedom to explore his desires is what Dorian's preservation of youth ultimately gives him. But it's not a perfect preservation of his reputation, and people do notice the acts that he does that are considered disreputable. It's simply that in polite Victorian society, for a man who is as upstanding as Dorian Gray in the general consciousness, it would be inappropriate to actively scorn him. They mostly care about whether or not it's okay to be seen with him. How do you apply this to modern day? I feel like it's fairly obvious, but guess what? We are in a social media digital age where a person can have a completely different online persona to their personal one, but this on here is what can get you sponsorship deals, social mobility, and the ability to make a decent amount of income. But you can't be your most authentic version of yourself or indulge in all of your hedonistic desires in front of a camera when you are trying to make yourself the product of appeal. The standards of Victorian society are obviously not as applicable today, but our own cultural society has its own set of standards that a lot of people feel compelled to obey in order to maintain marketability. And there's a lot of open secrets on the internet, but unless somebody makes a Netflix documentary about it, nobody really gets riled up before the direct confrontation of it. People can form parasocial relationships with figures they don't know and simply know their face and their entertainment content. Due to the general selectivity of the images projected, whenever somebody demonstrates a flaw, perhaps demonstrating immoral behavior or hypocrisy, that doesn't necessarily have to be a crime, people's careers can be ruined and their good rapport with a larger fan base can be destroyed, because the idea of them is incongruous with a glimpse of their reality. The reverse also works, where people who have been charged with literal crimes can still have a large and loyal following because they are simply appealing, and the people who are following them believe more in their looks or their personality or the more pleasant presentation of their persona on this thing than anything else. I think about all the avenues you can use in modern day about idolizing someone to the point where every action they do is excusable. I think about Dorian Gray and that Dahmer miniseries and Quiet on Set. I think about what heathenism even means nowadays. What kind of crimes can Dorian do in the modern day that would ruin his reputation to the point where he would lose all sponsors? I think about our reputation culture in general and how some people who are old hats in an industry have been allowed to get away with larger crimes simply because they make good art. I feel like this is the most direct avenue to go down and perhaps the most obvious, which is why I'm not completely destroyed by the concept of the beauty industry, but in my mind, the beauty industry is a factor, not the full premise. If you were going to do Dorian Gray with the beauty industry as the main idea, you're doing Neon Demon. I think my biggest reservation with the beauty industry is that it is first and foremost a job and like a ladder to climb for like this infinite appeal, and there will always be someone younger. It's this idea of a point of comparison, a fear of being aged out of the industry. Dorian Gray isn't afraid of being replaced. Dorian Gray is afraid of facing consequences for his actions and later for not being acknowledged for who he is. Dorian Gray is afraid of losing his youth and being unable to indulge in his current hedonistic desires. He's not aspiring to be seen, he's aspiring to live how he wants in the public eye, but be seen in one specific way. When I think about the beauty industry, I think about the preservation of beauty. I think about younger models and strict regimens of health, diet and self-care, and heightened awareness of your physical features and imperfections, and constant comparison to others, which I don't really think the book was that interested in. The beauty industry can be incorporated, I'm just not sure what the beauty industry in specific has to offer the story of Dorian Gray. And then there's Basil maybe being a woman, unsure, but if that's the case, I actually think this change would be interesting because we are talking about the opportunities of youth, and I think that a young woman has different opportunities with their looks in youth than a young man does, and I would like to see those explored. But Basil and Dorian being siblings rings weird to me because of what the portrait of Dorian Gray represents. Like the actual physical portrait that Basil painted. Basil doesn't see a flawed human being. Basil sees this beautiful young man in body and soul that he definitely wants to That picture is not actually a picture of Dorian Gray's soul, but his perception in larger society. That's his reputation. That's how he appears to others until Dorian asks to switch places with it. And another thing is, if you've had siblings, you know they're flawed human beings. I mean, you can look up to them, you can think well of them, you could admire certain facets of them, but you're going to remember the time they chopped off your Barbie's hair and stuck it in the air vent. You're going to remember the time they forgot to pick you up from soccer practice and you got to leverage that over them for a year and a half to give you free rides everywhere. So you also know they have flaws. The perfect image of their ultimate idolized form of purity and innocence, I feel like is hard to get. Unless we're going the Lannister route, which would be interesting. Also, the picture better not be a literal picture. At the very least, Photoshop must be applied. This cannot be an accurate representation of Dorian Gray as an actual objective human being. It has to be some sort of idolization. So those are my general thoughts. I can't wait to watch the 6-part series in 3 years and finally have something to actually critique and go over, but I'm very interested in the ideas here, apparently, because I just made this my whole weekend. I see potential in the premise. It's just a few pieces of the one sentence of marketing material that really got to me. Unfortunately, I haven't watched Supergirl, which Katie Rose Rogers, the writer for this show, was writing on before, so I don't know what her usual execution feels like. Her and Robbie Rogers wrote one episode each for Fellow Travelers. I heard it was good. I'll of course be excited to see it just to know, but their pitch on deadline did not give me the best confidence. So I've yelled at the sun for far long enough. I think it's time that I maybe open this up to others. So what do you think of the premise of a modern Dorian Gray adaptation? How would you modernize it? Do you think the sibling angle's gonna work? How much cosmetic surgery do we think Dorian Gray is going to be implied to have?
Thanks as usual to my patrons, and like, comment, subscribe, whatever the hell they make you do over here. Or don't, I don't know. I'm not gonna stop, so I don't really know what the point is, but